Last week of May 8th, Jodi told...
Exhibit, not in evidence.
Absolutely am. I'm impeaching her now with the statement because if you want, I'll address it.
Judge, it's not... Approach, counsel.
In your assessment in this case, what you've been telling us is that you took statements from a number of people, and we call them collateral sources, right?
Correct.
And you looked at those statements from other people, these collateral sources, and then you compared them to other collateral sources and any statements by the defendant, right?
Correct.
In this particular case, you viewed the statement of a collateral source, right?
I did.
Darrell Brewer, right?
Correct.
And in viewing the statement of Darrell Brewer, there was this statement about the defendant requesting or asking to borrow some gas cans in late May of 2008, right?
Correct.
And with regard to this statement from Mr. Brewer involving the gas cans being borrowed in 2008, the indication was that the defendant told him she needed to borrow 2 gas cans because she was taking long trip to Mesa and didn't want to run out of gas, right?
Correct.
In terms of you saying Utah and talking about Utah and how far Utah is, this page, ma'am, take a look at it again. It has no mention of Utah whatsoever. It doesn't. Read it.
Jodi said she was going to visit.
No, read it to yourself.
It does mention Utah.
And it mentions it at the very bottom, doesn't it?
No, it mentions it about in the same paragraph as the question about Mesa, and it mentions the Grand Canyon.
All right, go ahead. Let me get it back.
Okay.
But it mentions Utah, ma'am, after she goes to Mesa, right?
It says Mesa, and then it says the other things.
Right. It talks about what she's going to do, but it doesn't talk about Utah first, does it?
No.
And that created a problem for you, didn't it?
I had to ask it.
Didn't it?
It created a question for me.
Okay, it created a question for you because you thought this decision to go to Mesa was a last-minute decision, right?
Correct.
And what you did is, with regard to this issue, even though you reviewed a statement to the police and all the other items in this case, you decided to resolve this conflict or this question in favor of the defendant, right?
I asked the defendant about it. She told me that she had not said she was going to Mesa, she was going to Utah. And also the journals indicated, and the IMs when they were talking about planning trips. So I used other things to look at that. But yes, I had a question about it for sure.
And you decided to resolve it in favor of the defendant, irrespective of what you used, right? Irrespective of what sources you used, right?
No, in respect to other sources I used. And I don't remember the police report. I'm very sorry. I don't remember that.
With regard to this issue as to whether or not she was going to Mesa first, ma'am, isn't it a fact that you could have just called or had an interview with Mr. Brewer to try to determine what it was that he said? You could have done that, right? You do that as part of your investigations, don't you?
I could have, but I was basically told to rely on the information that I had.
Well, now you're indicating that you were restricted somehow by somebody. I don't want to know who you were restricted by. Have you ever voiced an objection here during testimony that you were ever restricted in your approach in this case?
No.
And in this case, no one was directing your investigation, was it? Were they?
No.
You're independent. In other words, you have an independent assessment, here to make an independent assessment, right?
Yes.
And as part of that investigation, you could have spoken to Darrell Brewer to see whether or not what his recollection was, right?
I asked about interviewing other people, and I was given the information, the collateral sources.
Isn't it true then that with regard to your finding that there was domestic violence in this case because you didn't do this interview, and it talks about different stories, isn't it true that your assessment of domestic violence is deficient?
No, I don't believe it is.
Even though you didn't interview Mr. Brewer, correct? Yes or no? I don't want to get any further than yes or no on this one.
Okay. I didn't interview Mr. Brewer.
And even though you didn't because you didn't interview Mr. Brewer, your assessment in this case, at least to a certain extent, is lacking.
I don't think so.
And you didn't interview, well, you're the one that told us that with regard to these kinds of things, conversations are only part of, conversations can form a part of your investigation, right? You did say that though, right? Yes or no?
The conversations are part of my, right.
And in fact, in other cases, you have conducted interviews with other people, correct?
In most murder cases, I have not.
So
I've used collateral sources.
So you're saying that with regard to your assessments in criminal cases, don't restrict it to murder cases. With regard to the criminal cases, what you're saying is you don't interview other people, you just interview the defendant and look at collateral sources. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
It depends on the case, and it depends on what is available for me to review. In some cases, there are financial restrictions. They say these interviews have been done. I'm given those interviews. So it depends on the attorney, and it depends, and it doesn't matter whether it's the prosecution or the defense, Mr. Martinez. There's a limit to what they give me, and
I'm really not asking you to go into that, and if you don't mind not going into that area
Okay.
you just went into, okay?
Right.
I'm just asking you whether or not, it's a yes or no, and if you can't answer yes or no, tell me and we'll move on, all right?
okay.
With regard to your other criminal cases, isn't it true that in those other criminal cases, on occasion, you have conducted interviews? Yes or no?
I really am reflecting on the criminal cases, trying to reflect on the criminal cases that I have done. Generally, it's been paperwork.
Generally means that you have, at least on a couple of occasions.
I'm leaving it open because I know that you are, you know, it's like very precise, and I am not certain, so.
So you don't know is what you're saying?
Yes, I'm not certain.
Ma'am, one of the things that your investigation revealed in this case, and we've talked about this issue of secondary gain, and we talked about some inconsistencies here, one of the things that your investigation revealed was that the defendant is very manipulative, isn't she?
I don't think that I don't believe I said she was very manipulative.
Isn't it true that you reviewed collateral sources that indicated the defendant was very manipulative?
There were collateral sources that said she was manipulative.
Right. Isn't it true that, in fact, it was people that were close to her who indicated, for example, that...
May we approach? You may approach. Continue.
You received information that the defendant was manipulative, correct?
Yes.
In fact, you received information that the defendant was not abused. She just...
Overruled that question.
Isn't it true that your investigation revealed that she was not abused, but liked to play the victim? And that's part of manipulation.
I don't recall that.
Let's take a look at your notes.
Okay.
Take a look at Exhibit 609, read the whole thing, if you don't mind concentrating on the highlighted portion. Have you read the whole page?
Well, I scanned it.
Go ahead and read the whole page, please. You reviewed it, correct?
Yes, I did.
Isn't it true that your investigation revealed that the defendant liked to play the victim?
This was about high school, Mr. Martinez.
Whether or not it's from high school, ma'am, isn't it true that that's part of something that you thought it was important enough to write down?
Let me answer that correctly. Let me answer that fully. I took notes on every interview, and I wrote down the essence of the notes. In that particular interview with Zaina, her high school friend, or junior high friend, her friend was talking about Jodi liking to play the victim, and that was in junior high or high school. So that was a piece of what I took into consideration, sure.
And playing the victim and being manipulative, that's a character trait, isn't it?
It doesn't have to be a character trait. It can be a transient situation. It can be situational, Mr. Martinez.
It can be situational, but there's no indication anywhere that this was a situational thing, was it?
It's the observation of one other young girl.
Who knew her well at the time that she was growing up, right?
A young girl.
Right. So you're saying that when an individual is of a certain age, you can't pay attention to what they say, right?
No, I paid attention to what she said and weighed it with the other things that I read.
So you did consider this information, is what you're telling us, in
Sure.
making this assessment. And the information that you considered was that growing up, the defendant liked to play the victim, right?
From one source. That was one source.
Did I ask you what source? I did not, did I?
I guess I'm trying to figure out if you want a complete answer or not.
I want you to answer my questions. Isn't it true that you just told me that you considered this information? Yes or no?
Yes, I considered it.
Isn't it true that the information that you considered was that the defendant was not abused, but she liked to play the victim? Yes or no?
Contrary to other sources, yes.
Am I asking you about contrary sources, ma'am?
Contrary
Yes or
to
no?
other sources, yes, that would be true.
And I'm not asking you about contrary sources. I'm asking you whether or not that's something that you consider. Yes or no?
Yes.
And this information that she, whatever it was, the term is manipulative, this is something that you had when you were considering this whole issue of abuse, right?
Correct.
And again, you gave the benefit of the doubt to the defendant because you never even asked her about it, right? Did you even ask the defendant about her playing the victim?